My name's Anand Menon. I'm Director of UK Inner Change Europe. We want to talk about the future of levelling up, I think both substantively and politically, because obviously there are question marks over the politics of levelling up after what's happened in the last few weeks. But to kick things off, way back in June,
Yeah.
we got YouGov to carry out a large survey of 20,000 respondents to ask people what they thought about their local area, about what could be done to improve it, and to try and sort of figure out what people thought about levelling up, what people wanted to see from levelling up. So we're going to kick off with Sophie, who is a researcher at UK Inner Change Europe, presenting findings. And then we've got Paul and Tim, who are sitting there to watch the slides to comment on what they hear, and then hopefully we can throw it open and have a conversation with the room. So Sophie, over to you.
So as Anand said, so at UK Change Europe, what we found was that quite a lot of previous research that had been done on levelling up was sort of about the policy options that were available under that agenda explicitly, as opposed to sort of the views of voters and public about what they want for themselves and their local communities. So to try and correct that oversight, as Anand said, we conducted a survey of 20,000 people from across England, which is the largest survey of its kind carried out on levelling up so far. And that was complemented by some focus groups that were conducted by our colleague Suzanne Hall from King's College's Policy Institute. And so together those two data collections sort of form the basis of our new report. So the first thing to start off with is that people like where they live, they're proud of where they're from. So across England, about 3 in 4 people feel at least quite proud of where they live, and we see very little variation in that figure across regions. What we did find was that at the individual level, the biggest factor that affects people's sense of local pride is their age and their level of financial security. So a person's age, their savings, their financial independence, their housing status, all of those things are correlated with local pride. So what we sort of understand from that is that people don't feel stable or secure, like they have that safety net, that impacts how happy they feel to be from where they are. We've seen a lot of discussion about redistributive policy in the aftermath of the Chancellor's mini-budget. What we found was that a majority of people in England think that the government should implement some kind of redistributive policy to tackle regional inequality. So around 68% of people agree with the idea that the government should redistribute from more well-off areas to less well-off ones. And we see very little difference in that figure when we compare groups by age, by gender, by education, social grade, region, all of those things. So that suggests that redistributing funding from more well-off to poorer areas is a broadly popular idea. As you can see from the figure on the whole, we did also see that if levelling up is framed around geographic inequality, so shifting money from richer areas to poorer areas, as opposed to inequality between people, so that shifting money from rich people to poor ones, we see increased support for the policy idea. There is one interesting exception to that otherwise quite broad base of support. So despite being a key plank of the 2019 manifesto, measures to tackle regional inequality are actually much more popular with Labour voters. So around 83% of 2019 Labour voters agree with the idea of redistribution to poorer areas, compared to around 56% of Conservative voters. That's very complicated by the fact that when we asked our respondents whether the north of England specifically gets its fair share of government spending, we saw a real split amongst Conservative 2019 voters. So around 90% of those Tory voters in the north of England think the north doesn't get its fair share of spending, but less than half of Conservative voters in the south agree that the north is not fairly treated. In fact, you can actually see from the figure here that a good chunk of Conservative voters in the south think the north gets more than its fair share of central government funding. Labour just doesn't have that same split in its electoral coalition. It's quite united in the idea of sort of redistribution of funding and the idea that the north doesn't get its fair share of spending. You can imagine that that's going to present Liz Truss with a choice to make. So a lot of those 2019 voters in the north of England, they likely voted Tory for the first time, in large part due to her predecessor's commitment to level up the north. She either pursues that commitment at the risk of losing traditional Tory voters in the south, or she puts those red wall votes at risk. We do see a north-south divide in our data. So respondents in the north are much more likely to think that they don't get their fair share of resources. That's particularly concentrated, as you can see here, in the north-east of England, where many of these red wall seats are located, where around 91% of people don't think their region gets its fair share of funding. And there is that sense that MPs and parties are too focused on the South East and London to the detriment of other parts of England. But something which cropped up quite a lot and which I think gets missed out in discussions is intra-regional inequalities. So respondents would actually sort of make an exception for London a lot of the time and say, it's a capital city, its needs and things it does different. But they will compare where they live to other cities and towns in their region. So, Nottingham to Derby, Bath to Newcastle, those local inequalities were actually often a lot more contentious. There was a sense that Levelling Up actually meant channeling funds into the bigger sort of metropolitan city in their region and not going any further than that. We also asked people what they thought had got better or worse in their local areas over the last decade. So we saw for the most part that people think their local communities have been in decline in a lot of ways over the last 10 years. The only thing that you can see here that substantially improved is internet availability and speed, though we have also seen sort of small increases for housing and good schools as well. Across England, in all of our groups, 2 issues stand out as having worsened in particular. That's the affordability of public transport, much more so than the quality, and crime levels, and that's particularly an issue for people living in poorer and more urban areas. And our respondents see the decline in the availability and the affordability of public services and social issues as interlinked. So a lack of opportunities contributes to people moving away from that area, which then leads to a lack of investment, a lack of resources, less opportunities for people, and then an increased rate of crime as well. So we then also asked what will make your area better. So from this list here, we asked the public to choose the one policy option that they think would most improve where they live. And even though public transport is a massive issue for our respondents, it's not a priority area for investment. So neither are issues like jobs, like shops, like high streets, which are sort of big recurring themes when we discuss Levelling Up. Actually, the most popular policy options were reducing crime and improving access to good quality healthcare. So that points to a tension between sort of what our findings say and current Levelling Up priorities. So the things that people actually think would most improve their local areas are actually really the responsibility of national government and are unlikely to sort of be tackled through devolution of power or very localised targeted spending. It also suggests that, when Liz Truss has talked about sort of reforming the Levelling Up agenda, so that's more around deregulation and making it easy for local authorities to sort of do their jobs as opposed to investment in public services, that actually doesn't really get to the heart of what voters want from this agenda or what they expect it to deliver. The other bad news is that people in general don't believe that politicians or political authorities in Westminster care about their area. So the numbers for either political party, as you can see, aren't great. So Labour is ahead on this measure, i.e. being felt to care more about the area, in the north by about 10%, but the situation is more neck and neck in the Midlands and in the south of England. We do also see a link with deprivation in our data, so we find that people are more likely to believe that the Conservative Party cares about their area the less deprived they are, and vice versa for Labour. But I think the most sort of surprising thing from our data is that the more local level of representation is, starting with local councillors, the greater the feeling is that that political actor cares about their area. That does present us with a difficult situation to resolve because obviously people are sceptical about how much Westminster cares about their area, but at the same time their policy priorities are ones that can only really be delivered by people who are outside of their immediate areas. So I think there's got to be some discussion about how we resolve that paradox. So just to finish off, we know what people sort of think about regional equality, about politicians, about Levelling Up, what they want for their area, but how do they actually want Levelling Up policy to be delivered? So a few things came out in our survey and our focus groups. The first thing is that timing is really important. So people prefer outcomes to be delivered quickly, but the public are sort of generally supportive of projects that can be delivered within 5 years, which suggests that if a party in the next election stands on a manifesto which commits to Levelling Up, they have till the end of a parliament to make inroads on regional inequality and tackling that issue, but asking for a whole other parliament might be problematic. Less surprising is that the more money the better, so the more expensive a project is, the more popular it is. But what I found quite interesting was that transparency is really a key issue for our respondents. So decisions about how investments are made, how money is allocated, who's involved with the implementation of that, consultation on projects, that all has a really big impact on public support for policy proposals. We did also find that any process that involves government ministers is just immediately less popular. So needs-based allocations are much preferred for the allocation of funding, which obviously isn't a huge vote of confidence with the current method of allocating funds under the Levelling Up Fund, in which local authorities submit bids and they are then judged by ministers. And then the final thing was how important community support for proposals was. So proposals which allow for community consultation were much more popular than those without it. And our focus groups were really enthusiastic about the prospect of community involvement. So things like town hall meetings, online consultation surveys, they were all really popular options for our respondents. So they are some of our key findings. The report is massive, it's about 90 pages long, so there's much more than that. And it comes out on the 20th of October, but that's just sort of a quick run through of the key findings that we have.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie, that was great. Whenever I hear those findings, all I can think is, who are those people who think internet speeds have got faster and where do they live? I mean, really? Okay, yeah, very nice.
That was our reward. That was our reward for another job. We got fast broadband in some way.
Interesting. Which of you wants to go first?
I'll do.
Right. Okay. Hello, quick one. Can we ask questions through the talk or afterwards? If you've got something pressing, yeah. I mean, okay.
So who funded that whole report? Financially?
It came, well, it's our funders who are the Economic and Social Science Research Council and the Policy Institute Kingsley funded it jointly. And it was done by YouGov.
Was it a couple of money?
Well, the SRC is state funded, yeah.
Okay. Hello everybody, my name is Paul Sunny. So I'm head up the research team at 7 Cities, where I think tank that tries to understand the geography of the national economy through the lens of geography. So why do we see these divides that we see across the country? What should levelling up be trying to do? Now, very interesting findings there that Sophie presented, particularly in terms of attitudes and I think the variation across the country. I think it's the challenge that any political party has got, I think, is trying to balance the demands and requirements of people who live in certain areas with actually what is sensible policy, and also what is actually going to get the economy going. And there's quite a few tensions within that. One of the key tensions I think within that are about where jobs are, and I've heard a lot I think over the last day and a half about how levelling up is about getting jobs in the places where people live. Which sounds sensible. It sounds sort of thing that you just pull a few levers and there we go, the jobs will move there. And yet the problem is that we've been trying to do that for many years, and the state hasn't got any invisible levers it can pull to try and move these jobs around. So we have to be careful about what it is that we can try and guarantee. When we look at the challenges that we do face across the country, we see that clearly the number of places that are struggling. But the places that, it's not just about places that necessarily are deeply struggling, it's places that are furthest away from where their potential is. So what could they be achieving? Where is the headroom for growth? And when we look at the data on this, what we see is the big problem the UK economy has is it's the underperformance of the biggest cities outside of London where the real challenge is. So if you go and walk down Broad Street into the new streets, you get a feeling of a Birmingham that is revitalised. But if you actually look at the wider performance of Birmingham, it punches well below its weight. It shows very far behind its comparators in Europe, such as Brussels, such as Munich, such as Frankfurt. And that's a big problem for the UK economy, because not only is this a place that's underperforming, but it's a big place that's underperforming, which is costing the UK economy many billions of pounds each year. Same with Manchester, same with Glasgow, same with Liverpool as well. So level up agenda in terms of trying to improve the economy needs to focus on the underperformance of these big places. In smaller places, where maybe trying to get those jobs in, where the headroom for growth is not so obvious, where the ability of the state to pull levers is a little bit more difficult, I think we move more into two elements. One is about transport connections into those big places, and the second one is about provision of good public services, particularly in perhaps places like Grimsby and Barrow, which are quite isolated geographically. Trying to link them into places, big cities not so far away, actually is kind of difficult because there are so many big cities near them. But there's certainly a case here about trying to find the best public service you possibly can provide around health, education, etc., which does then chime into some of the things that were presented there. So this is the dichotomy in terms of how we see things going on. The challenge we've got in terms of what we've seen since the leadership changed and the approach seems to have changed. So there's a broader challenge that it's not clear that levelling up is still a thing. Now, whether that's just the case that the phrase is being thrown in the bin and everything else is all right, or whether it's a broader challenge, we wait to see. But it seems that in terms of things that have been brought out so far, there's been a shift in direction actually away from the agenda. We've got investment zones, which we're not big fans of. I can come on to that in the questions. I think there's a broader challenge, a more scary challenge with this, is that the model seems to have shifted away from public investment to try and get places going and trying to improve public services as well, through the idea that we'll deregulate and everything will be all right. And I think from our research, that just doesn't seem that that's going to hold up. If we are going to leverage in private sector investment, we're going to need the public sector to go in first in places where there are market failures, overcoming those issues while the private sector is not investing in the first place. And then after the last 12 years of what local government and public services have gone through, the hardest hit of any government department in terms of austerity, if we're then going to look to trim the fat further, what does that then mean in terms of provision of public services, particularly in places like Barrow and like Grimsby? And I haven't heard an answer as yet on that. I think that's what concerns me in particular about the agenda. So that then is interesting how it interacts with the findings there. Hopefully we will hear something a little bit more positive in the next 48 to 72 hours. Not have any insight on that, but I do wait to see what is brought forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. I mean, Tim, while you were making your remarks as a sort of person who perhaps understands this political plot better than anyone else, is levelling up still going to be a thing for it? And is it the same thing that it was under the previous Prime Minister?
I don't know and no. I think it's
Okay.
the immediate answer to those questions. But what I would say, thank you so much for inviting me to, and this is such an important issue, and that's not just me trying to be flattering to my Leeds United supporting host, but it's because it does matter. And you look at the origins of this. Why are we talking about levelling up as a political party rather than perhaps as a patriot, concerned at our country? And one of the big moments, sort of for me, in the Brexit debate, I don't know if you remember it, was George Osborne, the Chancellor, was talking about the hit to GDP that would occur if we left the European Union. And there was I won't use exactly the term that she used, but a woman watching him said, "It may be your GDP, it's not my GDP." And I think that for me has always sort of resonated as an expression that there is an awful lot of people in this country who feel that somehow the economy doesn't work for them, and that the normal way that we measure growth and progress isn't something that connects with them. And look, I voted for leaving the European Union. We've been on stage together talking about the Brexit thing, and I voted because I believe in sovereignty and I want my parliament to take the decisions that really count. But not everyone who voted to leave the European Union had those sorts of sovereignty questions uppermost in their minds. A lot of them voted for a fundamental change. They felt something was wrong with their country. They felt there was an inequality. They felt they were left out. There was a massive, when the anti-establishment sort of rhetoric that was used during that campaign, of course, a lot of what people really felt was anti-London. There's just this sense that London had too much power and too much influence. And so when really we managed to finally get Brexit over the line, get Brexit done, or whatever the expression was, the levelling up agenda was supposedly the big answer by our party to that. If Boris Johnson had a big idea when he was Prime Minister, levelling up was it. And goodness knows our party's in a massive state at the moment. But the reason why I felt Boris in the end had to go wasn't so much because of Partygate and all the rest of it, although that obviously made it vulnerable. I think he would have survived as leader if he was actually doing stuff on the agenda that we really cared about, building homes, levelling up, etc. And so, as a party, this does represent, I hope this is a way of answering your question, Alan, but as a party, we have to recognise, this is really quite profound for us, we recognise that levelling up was absolutely what we needed to do in response to the Brexit phenomenon, and we have failed really to still come up with a definition of what it means. And I would put it even in a broader context than that. I think there's a massive shift taking place in global politics. It's not just happening in the United Kingdom, it's happening around the world. And this is an oversimplification, what I'm going to say, but not too much of one. Is that poorer people, more blue-collar people, people more at the blunt end of economic change are moving right, and people who have been university educated, more in the idea sector, however you want to present it, are moving left. And I think that presents a real challenge to us. Do we recognise that as something that's permanent? I would argue that it is, and it's huge. And how do we respond to that? And I think we need to respond to it. And I think it's most intriguing for the Conservative Party, really, because for the Labour Party and the left, they can almost kind of ignore this. They can carry on with existing policies because the existing policies are serving their new voters. For the right, we have both an electoral and a patriotic challenge to recognise that this underlying shift is taking place. How do we serve those poorer, more economically vulnerable, more culturally insecure groups who feel that the country isn't working for them? I think one of them is shifting from university education to more vocational education as a priority. I think it's certainly moving from taxation of income to assets, I think. And then one of the other big things I would say would be about house building. And then another thing would be this general thing about inequality across geography, which has been the main topic we're here to today. So just briefly on that, how many iterations have we had now? Because actually it didn't just begin with Boris Johnson. To his credit, back to George Osborne, I think he was the person, I don't know whether you would agree with this, Anand, but actually of all the Conservatives that have tried to wrestle with this in the last decade, he was the one who took it most seriously. It began perhaps too focused on Manchester, with the Manchester sort of the northern powerhouse, but there was the Midlands engine. There was a real attempt to change that. And I'm afraid there was an awful lot of petty politics involved. So do you remember when Theresa May took over, she basically cleared Downing Street of almost every single Cameroon in the building. They had a sort of a slightly snooty attitude to the northern powerhouse. And then we're going, without going through all the various iterations, we're now in another stage whereby some interesting intellectual work that Michael Gove did a year ago or so with his Levelling Up paper seems to have been completely cast aside, and we're starting all over again. The challenge, therefore, for our party is to think, we have to somehow, and I think this is true of generally some of the level of intellectual discussions we're having, is we need to stop thinking of this as Osborne's project, or May's version of it, or Boris's project, or now whatever Simon Clarke is going to come up with. We need to think about, what do we really think about this? What is the distinctively conservative approach to levelling up? And then hopefully, if we are lucky enough to stay in government, we can start pursuing it consistently. I would say, and I'm really very interested, Paul, you coming back to me on all of this, because hearing what you just said, there was a big emphasis on infrastructure, I think, in what you're saying, and I would agree with that, and that's certainly where George Osborne started. But probably I would say there should be a much bigger emphasis on education as the levelling up issue. I think education for me, after family, is probably the big determinant of a young person's chance in life. So therefore, do we need to put education as much more of our public spending, levelling up priority? And also, back to the distinctive sort of conservative thing, tax competitiveness as well. How do we ensure that there are tax and public spending rewards for northern and levelling up areas? And what do I mean by levelling up areas? That, of course, is another question. And then I'll shut up with this final remark. The other thing we have to wrestle with is just the complexity of it. Do you remember during the leadership election, there was this New Statesman video that caught Rishi Sunak in Tunbridge Wells, I think it was, talking about, don't forget, I managed to succeed when I was Chancellor, taking money from deprived urban areas to rural areas. I can't remember exactly how it was said, but it looked like, and it was daft politics on his part, but it looked like he was proud of taking money from deprived urban areas to rich rural areas. Of course, in reality, to be fair to him, is that what he was trying to say was that rural poverty is really real as well. And there's been this big emphasis on urban areas in the north, when actually if you live in Cornwall, or you live in Lincolnshire, or you live in the valleys of Wales, actually poverty in some of those rural areas is worse in some respects. How do we, therefore, take people with us so that they don't think that this is an agenda that's alien to them? And that's where I think we get in some of the, where I'm most interested in learning from what Paul has to say, is do we still have to say, though, that for those rural areas to benefit, you need to focus on the cities, because it's the ripple effect, I don't want to use the expression like trickle down, but is it the ripple effect from the investment in those cities that affect all of us? And you can't actually do too much just by focusing on rural areas. Or is, back to what I was saying about education, well, education, if we invest in that across the nation, will benefit everyone, wherever it is. So I think it's great that you're all here. For me, this is the most important intellectual debate that our party needs to have. And the sad thing is we've hardly begun it yet, even though it's probably the most important thing we do need to tackle.
Thank you, Tim. I mean, my George Osborne recollection from the referendum was he made a speech or did a press conference in which he said, I've got to warn you that if we vote for the European Union, the City of London will be damaged and house prices will go down. I remember getting a text from a friend of mine in West Yorkshire saying, has Osborne swapped sides? As if, you know, house prices going down and the city taking a hit didn't sound all that bad to someone in West Yorkshire who didn't have a house. So the economic debate got quite confusing. I agree with you absolutely that was the driving force of this. The one thing you didn't talk about there, which I find interesting, is there's an electoral calculation here, isn't there? Because the Conservatives have a whole new coalition, which was sort of, you know, they started building it in 2017. Johnson got it over the line in 2019. And it's a coalition that is united, if you like, on the cultural side of politics. You know, they can talk about Brexit or immigration, but is hideously divided. That slide from Sophie showed over economic priorities. I suppose the simple question is, can any politician, apart from Boris Johnson, with his enormous facility for ambiguity, which is a fleeting strength, which is a you know, praise, not a criticism, because I mean it's an important skill in politics. Is there another prime minister who can hold that coalition together in the way he did?
We're just going to be back in 6 months.
Oh, okay.
Exactly.
I didn't say that, just in case the press.
I heard it.
Look, well, of course, you do need a certain level of ambiguity always in politics.
Yeah.
You need in marriage, in life, you need a certain level of ambiguity. Some things are best not always discussed to the nth degree. But I think there isn't even, I would argue, and people in this room should counter me if they disagree, but there isn't even a basic agreement on what the contours of this policy look like. You take something like HS2 versus HS3. You know, for me, HS3 was by far the most important, which was the Trans-Pennine rail link. You know, we don't just want, you know, I can see the advantage of HS2, but I can see also some risks that HS2 sucks things even further to London. Whereas HS3 seems unambiguously good for helping the North integrate. And so I think we probably, you know, or maybe we could almost do it in this room, I'm sure, but you know, draw up a list of what are the big questions you need to answer. You know, how much is this about infrastructure or education? How much is this about cities versus towns? You know, have a few of those questions. And the Conservative Party, you know, we've been used to 20, 30, 40 years talking about Europe and defence and tax. I don't think we have had enough of a conversation about levelling up so that we as a party have got to a critical majority that are comfortable with the consensus way forward on this.
Okay, we've got plenty of time left now to have a discussion with the room as a whole. Yeah.
It's where you're coming up. I come from Scotland. Scotland always suffers from diaspora of its best people leaving south. The reason why it's Scottish independence, because in London that's where all the best goes. We find politics is London-centric. The finance of the country is London-centric. Media is London-centric. So wherever there is power, there is money. And you know, working in local councils, 90% of the money for local councils come from central government. And if 45% of the population think local councillors can do better, why not give the councils more money, more power and more money-raising revenue to do their duties locally?
Should we take a few, or do you want to?
You want to?
Gentleman back.
Chris Smith, I launched a think tank called the Centre for the New Midlands back in January 2020. Great time to start a not-for-profit, I'm sure you all agree. But basically, there are a couple of comments I just wanted to make. I think you're absolutely right about the HS2 and the fact that the third leg of that hasn't happened. I think it's a crazy policy for the Tories not to have continued with that. Just in terms of the whole use of the term levelling up, you know, it's an apolitical think tank that I run, so we have people from across the political divide involved. And it was only, you know, 3 or 4 months ago that the debate we were having internally was about, you know, is this now a cross-party term, levelling up? So for the Tories, basically, to what it looks like, to almost put this right on the back burner or almost, you know, distance itself from the concept is quite astonishing, you know. And the third point I just wanted to make was obviously touching on what Paul was mentioning around Birmingham. I mean, only today, a little plug, but, you know, we published an article from a senior member of staff within Birmingham City Council, which was basically talking about, you know, essentially the combined authority and Birmingham City Council putting a lot of their hopes on the regeneration of East Birmingham, which is a 250,000 population area. A lot of that is going to be driven by HS2 and the big infrastructure spend, and hopefully what that area is going to be able to benefit from the big public investment. Just to give you just quickly on that, Birmingham East, an area of entrenched deprivation and inequality, where 85% of wards are in the 10% most deprived in England. So you've got, you know, that's the scale that you're talking about in terms of wanting to level up different parts of the country, and it's not just London versus the north.
Wonderful, thank you. Do any of you want to come back? We'll come back to the next 2 questions in a minute. To either of those 2
Yeah. So
issues about devolution or Westminster.
So I totally agree on devolution. Again, this was something that George Osborne started, and much to his credit, and I think sort of pushed it through more probably than what his predecessors have done since. The Level Up white paper, it's only 8 months old. It's incredible that it seems like it's been thrown in the bin after we were working on it for 2.5 years, and we and central government and politicians, etc. I think that's something to reflect on. In there, actually, was pretty radical about devolution, and in the 2019 manifesto, there actually was going to be a white paper on devolution in England. Scotland's a different issue; they should go down the same route. It did actually start to be a paper on devolution in England, which then morphed into levelling up. Some of the best parts of the Level Up white paper were about devolution. We've had a couple of deals signed since. There's the idea that it's not just about also trying to fill in the gaps across the country, but also about trying to deepen it too in Greater Manchester and here in the West Midlands as well. The question now is, what does the current leadership think about that? The number of deals in the in-tray at the moment of government, and it's not clear as to whether Liz Truss will sign them off or not. My understanding is that Simon Clarke did approve them when he was in the Treasury just before we had a leadership change. He's obviously now in deal. Let's see what happens. Will there be an announcement today or tomorrow about further devolution? Well, that will be the next step on, you know, a long road that we still need to go down to get to the point where we're talking about fiscal devolution, or indeed just giving places, you know, single pots of money. Here's your money. You decide how to spend it over a 4 or 5 year period. And the way we sort of operate with government departments currently, I think that's where we want to get to with some of those local areas to deal with some of the issues that Sophie raised. The East Birmingham point, I think, is an interesting one, because it then comes back to what you were saying, Tim, about skills infrastructure. So for me, if we can only do one thing around levelling up, it will be skills. Forget infrastructure. You know, it's a priority, but it's not number 1 priority. And for me, actually, even HS3, I'm quite sceptical about that. I think if we were to spend all that money on skills instead, that would be a much better use of cash. Why is that? What we know is that high-skilled businesses are going to stick their pins somewhere on the map of the UK where they can get skilled workers. We see that if we look at the patterns of where foreign businesses have invested over many decades in the UK. The challenge that we have further north is we haven't got enough skilled workers to attract those businesses in sufficient numbers. And until that changes, why would a high-skilled business go and invest in a certain place? So if I take an example of Nissan, for example, I think any levelling up policy needs to pass the Nissan test. So what's the Nissan test? Nissan, I was saying, well, you can tell from my accent, everyone knows surely that Nissan employs about 7,000 people in Sunderland. You know, huge factory. But it doesn't do its high-skilled stuff there. It does its engineering in Bedfordshire, and it does its design in Paddington. So here's Nissan, you know, poster child of what Thatcher did, got those jobs in, you know, thank God that she did. I don't know what it would have been otherwise, they've got those jobs in. But even Nissan, that's got a very firm foothold in Sunderland, doesn't put its high-skilled jobs in Sunderland. Why? Sunderland offers access to lots of cheap land and lots of cheap workers. If you're trying to put together, you know, manufacturing, which is putting things together, components together, that's what you're looking for. If you want to do things around, you know, high-skilled type stuff, you're looking for access to lots of high-skilled workers, and actually access to other sort of high-skilled businesses as well, which you get in and around Paddington in particular. Until any levelling up policy needs to be put in Sunderland in a position that will be able to attract those high-skilled jobs north. And until we do that, we're going to constantly continue to have this conversation, which is why cutting costs further, in my view, is not going to do levelling up. So why do I then, so that's why skills is important. How is that then relevant back to East Birmingham? Well, Birmingham's turning itself around. You know, it's still got a long way to go, and government support is required in order to make that happen. From an East Birmingham perspective, you know, you told us, Chris, about the issues around poverty, etc., which need to be dealt with. For me, that's much more of a focus on skills requirement rather than infrastructure requirement, and that's where we should be going. So, you know, if HS2 can be doing something to try and stimulate some of that, yes, we should definitely do that. But if we only did the HS2 stuff but didn't do anything about skills, we're in a position of, you know, a gradually growing Birmingham city centre while people on the doorstep can't access those jobs. And we see that problem exactly in London. You know, Barking and Dagenham struggles, despite being on the doorstep of one of the most successful CBDs in the world. Why is that? Skills seems to be the big issue. Transport connections are good, but skills are still the issue. So that's why, for me, skills would be the big. It wouldn't be the only thing you would do. If you only could do one thing, that would be it.
Paul, just very quickly, before I come to Tim, on the devolution question, I mean, there's obviously an issue about whether you extend devolution and where, but isn't there also an issue about just revisiting the sort of devolution deals we already have? Because there's an unevenness, isn't there? I mean, Andy Burnham has more levers to pull than other metro mayors, and that seems to affect outcomes quite profoundly.
So it does, and then Sadiq Khan has got
Yeah.
more levers to pull
Yeah.
than what Andy Burnham's got to pull. It's amazing that we shout about transport spend, which I think is completely skews the argument. It's amazing when we don't shout about how unfair it is that the London mayor's got all these powers that mayors elsewhere in the country don't have. I just don't understand that. That's where the power is. Even just TfL. You know, why don't we have TfL powers elsewhere in big cities across the country? And people don't seem to get upset about that,
Yeah,
which is amazing. But even, you know, the powers that Sadiq Khan has got are pretty limited compared to what we see elsewhere in the world, which then takes us towards questions around fiscal devolution. So I think if we have to see this as a journey that we're on. I think if we only get in the position to say, well, it's not fair that sort of Burnham's got X, so so he shouldn't be getting anything more. We should be going at the pace of the slowest. We're just never going to get to where we get to. So I'm comfortable with the variation. I think for me, it's about setting out what is it actually that we're trying to achieve eventually. Where are we heading to? Even going at different speeds, and everywhere might get there eventually. For me, it's two elements. One, especially, is about this idea of single pots of money, you know, over 4-year period, 5-year period. Off you go, you spend it with accountability. To some degree, what happens in terms of the arrangement with Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but not totally. Then the second element might be around fiscal devolution, which is, right, okay, well, how much of that tax can you raise locally to fund your services, which is what happens elsewhere in the world as well.
Tim?
Right. We can have the Scherzer room is it the Scherzer room we're in? The Scherzer room declaration, because I'm completely with you what you said on skills. I don't know what the people in the room are, but maybe that's one of the questions answered we were talking about earlier. That's where I would put it. On the devolution question, I think I'd probably answer it in sort of indirect way if it's not evasive. And for me, the big problem is just how do we get the most long-term solution? You know, short-termism, I think, is the disease of Western democracy at the moment. How do we get what we need long-term for a community or a region? Now, if that's delivered by local government, most likely, then definitely. If it's going to take central government, I don't know. But you know, the danger I think we face, and this is certainly what Labour is criticising our party for at the moment, is that in order to get a quick hit in terms of the general election, we're building leisure centres, and we're putting a lick of new paint and a new sort of pedestrianisation in a town centre, but we're not actually dealing with the underlying problems. Now, I think probably Paul will perhaps have better ideas than this, but we probably will need a creative set of solutions. We need to compare which ways work, but almost giving local communities a choice. You know, giving them a menu of options and saying, you know, we've got £1 billion to spend in your region. How would you like it to spend over the next 10 years? We can deliver so that you have a new leisure centre in 3 years. You can have a new technical college then built, so you'll have it at year 7, and so you can track the progress of this £1 billion. Or would you like a high-speed rail link to I'm simplifying hugely, but you get the idea of what I'm trying to say. Can we actually do a sort of a quite sophisticated but honest engagement with a region through their elected representatives and say, these are the choices that we face as policymakers. We can give you a quick sugar it, well, you would put it pejoratively because maybe these are real choices, but we can give you a quick gain in your infrastructure, the architecture of your town, or you can build something long term. And it may well be that they say, actually, you know, the facilities, a new academy is more important to us than that high-speed rail link. But I would say we aren't having that honest conversation with voters at the moment. And whether you use citizens' juries, what do I mean? Not citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies or something, but you know, we can try all different sort of mechanisms. But I think it's how we get to the community actually owning the decision through local devolution or so, whoever does it, that seems to me to be the end that we need to get to.
Yeah.
And to come in
Right,
on that.
because just on that, very quickly, I think that's what we get to with the, you know, with the transport spending in the north perspective. I think that we don't allow people to have, or places to have that choice. It is, from their perspective, it's the only game in town. It's like, I'm not going to get anything else. So yes, of course, I'm going to jump up and down about trying to get this, because if I don't get this, I'm getting nothing. You know,
Yeah.
I appreciate the politics of that, and it gets you into positions of not then making decisions that you're saying that might well be the best in those places.
So, say one about thing just on this whole business of.
Sorry?
I don't know, you keep interrupting and we've not heard from the woman from the side. Actually, so many people coming in.
No time to
Go on.
conclude.
No, I'm definitely not speaking now.
No, it was just two quick things. The first thing was that what came across in our surveys and in our focus groups was that, you know, devolution is definitely popular and it's definitely something that people want, but just to sort of, it links to what Anne and Paul as well, is that people do worry that it will actually entrench regional, intra-regional inequalities further. Because what came across quite a lot was people would say was, well, my local authority doesn't have the same, you know, experience or the same resources to put together a bid for funding as, you know, the local authority down the road does. So, you know, I'm from Liverpool, if you can't tell already, and so the closest comparison I can think of is Liverpool Council has actually quite a strong set of resources and people with a lot of experience put together these bids for funding and sort of future projects. But Halton Council down the road doesn't nowhere near the same level of experience. So it's you know, there would be a worry that they're just going to get dropped these pots of money but not actually have the skills to use them in a way that would most benefit their local communities. And then the other thing that I just wanted to touch on was that community consultation. Like, I can't sort of exaggerate how important that was to people in our survey, to the point where what we did was an experiment where we will present people with two levelling up policies that, you know, could be similar in a lot of ways, but one or two aspects would be different, and we'd ask them to choose the one that they most preferred. And quite a lot of the time people would actually sacrifice more money for a more transparent process with higher levels of community involvement. I think that's actually important for getting people to really feel like they've got a stake in this policy and actually sort of buy and support for it. Because I think at the minute it comes across to a lot of people that there's people in Westminster who have no idea about their area, just dropping pots of money for funds that and projects that don't actually benefit where they're from. If you give local community groups that opportunity to feel like they've had a chance in not just the plans but the implementation of those projects, it actually increases support, you know, for the people who give them the money, so there's an electoral benefit, but also in the long term people are more willing to sort of work to implement that project to a higher sort of quality over a long period of time.
Lady at the back.
So follows on from that, I'm interested in the panel, so I'm Helen Pidd, I'm the Guardian's North of England editor. I'm interested in the panel's view on the benefits of the Levelling Up Fund and whether you would favour actually giving that money to local authorities or mayoral authorities. Because there's quite a strong argument to say, if you look at the things that were bid for example, Tim mentioned the leisure centre, you know, Halifax is getting a new swimming pool, the kind of things that they would have done pre-2010 had they not had their budget slashed. Yeah, so what do you think, Levelling Up Fund or more money for local authorities?
Gildas Vilkalis, think tank Localism 2.0. I've actually got an answer to Tim Montgomery's question about what is a long-term sustainable solution to devolution. And I've been studying actually the topic of devolution since 2013. I've discovered a lot of interesting things, and one of the important revelations was that when you have a state that is as highly fiscally centralized as it is the United Kingdom, where 95% of all taxes go straight to national government, what happens, all of the most talented and ambitious business people and talented employees try to huddle together into a single center, which happens to be London in this case. And which means there is a brain drain of all of the things that's needed for local sustainable economy that's fleeing anything that's not near London.
Yeah, listen to that. Listen
Exactly,
to that.
yes. And the only way really to really kind of disrupt this unhealthy dynamics is to enable local councils, local authorities to make themselves, to attract enough local businesses to base at their location instead of London. But when almost all of the taxes go straight to London, which is one of the important levers, basically just local authorities don't have enough tools to make a meaningful difference. So that basically means that for as long as we stick to the formula that taxation system as it is, and it remains as it is, and maybe central government will throw a little bit more money to the local authorities to, and they call it devolution. Think of it this way, GDP of the UK is £2 trillion, which means £2 billion is 0.1% of GDP. And when you read the white paper of the devolution white paper, basically they talk about, you know, the £4 billion for the next 3 years in the leveling up fund and this and that. You add up all of that and then they go to like tens of millions. We're talking about, I think I did a calculation about 0.15% of GDP. That's kind of the total funds that are allocated extra. I mean, that's barely a round of error, it's insulting. It's like there is this underlying philosophy in the finding that local authorities are like incompetent babies. So it takes a wise parental figure of the central government to take care of all of them. Essentially the needs, and then once in a while they throw them a little allowance so that the child can buy a toy that will make them happy for a few days. It's very unsustainable, yes, we throw that money and then next time nothing changes, businesses are still in the local authorities, so next year you have to spend again money so that the local area does not dissolve into chaos because people don't have money to live on. So really, so I have worked out the whole framework how to do it well, and I'll be happy to send it to everybody who's in that.
Bring it opposite way around this time.
I think just on the brain drain thing, I think that is definitely something that came up a lot. People feeling that, you know, if they had children, their children would have to move away eventually because there just wasn't the opportunities for them where they lived. But I think there's a question of how you then tackle that. If that, you know, if skills is a massive part of that, but is that actually something that we talk about enough as part of the levelling up agenda, or is that its whole of a separate issue with reform of education? I think there's that clash between sort of the big structural changes in policy that need to happen and sometimes the short-termism that comes with the levelling up agenda. Actually, a lot of the things that we're talking about there are things that require sort of a big national level overhaul in policy thinking, I think, as opposed to, you know, dropping a bit of money on a local authority to change a situation that's been developing for decades. Is, you know, that's a lot of expectation for this type of fund, and I don't think it would resolve the issue that we're talking about there.
I've never understood why universities don't do what US state universities do and offer massive discounts to local kids to try and keep people in the area.
Well, I think I do think some do that, or they do sort of like lower offers, and like there is some universities do, but obviously it's not.
It's the money that will really make
Yeah.
I don't generally understand really why universities haven't become much more competitive in their nature of their courses, local enticements, you know, length of courses, etc. Anyway, so that's a whole other issue though. But, you're probably closer. Yeah, it does. Look, your diagnosis there is completely incorrect, and I look forward to being well president to solve all these problems for us. The problem is, of course, we start from where we are, and at the moment we do have this massive centralisation of resource and expertise, and it's very difficult for a government, we keep mentioning this expression, short-termism, to go from a situation whereby all that sort of expertise is centralised, and they still therefore want to control it. Obviously, I think the efforts that are being made to set up Northern Powerhouse, to devolve to mayors, are an attempt to begin to change that, to address what Sophie said about the inequality of local capacity in certain areas to bid for money, etc. How we get from your paradise, from where we are, is of course a really tricky question.
One of the major selling points to the conservatives who are in power, basically, if they follow the current white paper thing, it will produce a meh result. And when the party is 10 points behind in the polls and they want to keep their jobs, then meh is just not good enough. If you look at the electoral calculus website, it seem to do very good electoral analysis. If election were to be held today, conservatives would lose about, is it 124 or 164 seats? And furthermore, if Labour and Lib Dems were to make an electoral pact, which means whichever ones is not likely to win, they remove themselves from constituency so that the vote of the left doesn't get split. then actually the prediction is that Conservatives would end up with 102 seats after the next election. That would be worse and more disastrous than 1997. So kind of one of my major selling points is that if you value your career, you should seriously consider that.
Is it incentives?
Helen, please question. I just think, obviously, local government. I think if I look back at some of the decisions taken on austerity, the cuts to local government were the worst, the hardest, and they clearly need to be reversed in some measure as a priority. Local government is the unfashionable part of our constitution. So look, it's got to be both. We do need something special, and I think the kind of mechanisms we've been talking about that would deliver regional growth, I think they need to be working with local government, perhaps separate from them. But yeah, you can't deny the fact that local government, particularly in some of the services that are most vulnerable, are underfunded.
Well, I think actually the response to the two questions tied together. So to answer your question directly, Helen, it's you would give more money to local authorities. I mean, what's interesting is that we've had a lot of discussion about devolution over the last 6 or 7 years. At the same time, we've actually been centralising funding by saying we're going to cut your budgets through austerity, and then here's some small pots of money to try and replace some of that. And someone just it was Martin Rees from Bristol described it as the playground game scramble, which was one kid has a sweep, he throws it in the air, and then all the other kids go diving for it. And you shout scramble, you try and get it. That's what these competitive funding bits are like. Throw some money up in the air a little bit, and everybody, so any game in town, has to go for it. So we shouldn't be in that position. We should be about trying to give more power locally rather than less. And it's a shame that the level up fund has gone the opposite way. It's also interesting. It's just tiny compared to the size of the cuts that have been put through. Now, what really worries me about this is Simon Clarke's comments about fat stuff cuts. I don't understand how you can say that after 12 years of what local government in particular has gone through. Hardest hit department of any part of government. Within that, it was urban authorities within the north of England that were hardest hit. Within that, Barnsley and Liverpool were the two hardest. Where's the factor cut there, Simon? Go and visit them. Go and visit your own councils in Teesside and see where they're going to see where that's coming from. And I do find that quite scary. But in terms of how to square a degree of that circle, to come back to your comments, in order to achieve some of this, and the devolution element in particular, and some of the challenges that you put forward as well, Sophie, is that we do need local government reorganisation. We've got too many local authorities cutting across each other, and actually, if we were able to expand the size of some local authorities in some parts and get rid of duplication, actually have larger institutions that will be able to take on some more of these powers, I think that would put local government in a stronger position. We can't have a discussion about devolution and passing down more powers without also having that discussion about reorganisation. And so if we look at, say, a place like Nottingham, for example, if you fly over Nottingham in a plane, you could draw a map, a line around where the built-up area is. In that built-up area, it would be 9 different local authorities. There's a unitary council for the centre. There's another 6 district councils. You've got 2 counties that sit above it. So you could have a position where in Gedling, in Nottingham, you decide to build some houses. In Nottingham City Centre, you decide to build some offices for some jobs. Gedling decides the planning for the housing. Nottingham City Council decides the planning for the jobs, and then it's the county council that decides the transport links from the houses to the boundary of Nottingham, where then it becomes the responsibility of Nottingham City Council. Seems a bit weird, doesn't it, for one economy? I think we need to change that.
Some of the local authorities managed by Labour from last 20 years, they're not going to come in. They're going to remain red only. Whatever money pumping. I'm not telling that we are conservatives. So
We've got to remain one, sorry, I didn't catch
meaning
that.
is this, you are saying, a lot of people are saying, give power to more to the local authorities.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on the person, people who are managing the local authorities, who have power, who are managing it. You give as much as money, they remain in red only. You see in London, Brent, last 20 years, lot of money with them. Wembley developed anything, still poverty keep going. So it is nothing to do with the money, the people who managing it, the area, the skill, which is not mentioned here, only mentioned ministerial involvement, unpopular. Skill is very important. The people who managing it, you give as much money to an idiot.
You must think a lot of national politicians in that case.
Well, it's a common problem. I would say the quality of local councillor and the quality of MP are both declining an awful lot. There's there's almost like an ecosystem, a narrow ecosystem, whereby we've bred a certain kind of person who has to be a politician now. We don't have people from a diverse sort of sections and enough of life. And so, my goodness, local government reorganisation is unpopular enough with a lot of the councillors who are probably in this room.
Indeed.
But I would also talk about we're just reducing the number of councillors, moving towards fewer, higher quality perhaps local elected officials who could be better resourced and better staff and more motivated to actually take up local service.
CEO earns 250,000 pounds. So what kind of staff you want? They are very good staff. 250,000 pounds, very good salary. From last 20 years, pay is going up. Still, we are in rent, poverty keep going up, 32%, 35%, 36%. And London keep paying money. So it's not like that we are throwing money. London is very important part of our economy. You can't just say, oh, London is throwing money. It's very hard to make money. Yes, we can, 4 brothers are there, 1 or 2 are not earning. One is earning, if you kick every day one who's earning, we always be in bad position. So we have to balance out that part, not one-sided.
Completely.
Thanks, this panel is fascinating, so thank you for organising it. One thing that I think is particularly concentrated is tourism, that only certain areas benefit from tourism, and I wonder if the panel have any thoughts on how tourism dispersal can support the levelling up agenda as more tourism brings in more business, grows local economies. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
The Quake was always overrun with tourists. Are there more questions for you?
Yeah, so there's got to be something there first for tourists to want to visit. I think it feels like a bit of a banal thing to say, but it's important within that. But I think beyond that, it's not with the great respect for the types of jobs that tourism tends to generate. They tend to be low skilled. You see that in Cornwall, and that's the big challenge they have. Is that we have lots of tourist jobs, but actually wages are low, and it causes all sorts of problems. What we really need to do is try to get more high-skilled, high-productivity businesses across the country who gravitate to the Greater South East. This brings me back again to this Nissan test, which is what policies are you going to put in place so that if Nissan was to choose to make its investments again, it would actually put some of those high-skilled jobs in Manchester or Newcastle or Sunderland, and that's how we should measure it, and that's where skills for me comes at the very top of our priority list.
Actually, one question I had about skills is, a few years ago, so much happened in politics these days. There was a rather good further education white paper, wasn't there, which just disappeared from sight.
It's got to heaven before the other one.
Yeah, it struck me that reading it at the time, I just thought it was quite good. They seem to be taking this seriously. It actually seems to be a decent way of dealing with education, which isn't university education. And as far as I know, there's been no real follow-up to it.
Ian Duncan Smith once said to me when he was trying to get universal credit through, that the thing that most annoyed him was there was a particular problem, some of you may remember, with universal credit in its early days, and a civil servant would say, yeah, we're on to that, and we'll be fixed in 6 months' time, and then 6 months later that civil servant would be at the table to be held accountable for it. Now I think perhaps the question also needs to be reversed to ministers. Ministers are constantly reshuffled, and so just as we would say, as perhaps Conservatives, we want our civil servants to change their structure to be more accountable, I think we've got to put a higher price on just ministerial continuity, because there is this problem of not invented here. They always want to, a new minister wants to make their own mark, but there's also just this lack of accountability for starting a project at the start of the Parliament, still being held accountable to it for 4 years. If we have a short-termism problem, that's going to be amplified if we are going on a merry-go-round with ministers. Housing is the number of housing ministers we've had over the years is the most obvious example of this.
Sure. DCMS as well. Any more questions or comments for the... Yeah. There's no more.
So I think you mentioned the kind of 2 key things that people are really keen to see in their local areas around crime and health, and I just wondered if the panel had any comments about those 2 areas in particular and how we level up in that sense.
Yep.
Thanks, really interesting panel. So Matt Houlihan, I work for Cisco, it's a large US technology company. So I wanted to ask you about the sort of internet availability statistic you mentioned earlier, and whether you're able to sort of get under the surface of that. Because obviously having the availability of the internet is a prerequisite, I guess, to access some of these more modern jobs and to grow businesses of the future. But if we don't have the right sort of skills to work with it, we don't have the right ability to adopt that sort of technology in businesses. I wonder whether you looked at those sorts of aspects too. And if I may, Aaron, just to give one perspective from a business point of view, what we're seeing more and more of, particularly with the combined authorities, is some really good practice, we think, in terms of trying to get businesses like ours to contribute to the local economy in other ways, other than just simply providing the technology, in our case, to a city. So as part of that process, we're asked to run skills courses, for example, in a city, or do charitable work, or there's lots of different things that we're asked to get involved in. I mean, it'd be great to get any reflections on that, but we've really noticed that in the past couple of years, really coming as a feature of doing business with local government.
Yeah, about the internet availability, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was more sort of in reference to like domestic use, so it wasn't sort of like, we didn't ask about like digital skills or things like that, so, but we also weren't sort of explicit, it was just sort of, who to interpret that question, so I'm not 100%, I'm not sure 100% sure we collectively watch on like sort of digital skills or anything like that, but I think, the fact that it's increased by such a massive margin shows that I think people do think that's an incredibly important part of their everyday life, to the point where they value it, just as much as sort of schools and, housing access, and it's, one of the most important things that they talk about. With the crime and the healthcare, I think in the focus groups it came across as that sense of just sort of having like a safety net, like the reliability of central government and that sense of stability is how I think it came across. The interesting thing about crime in particular is that, it was, people did think it had got worse, sort of the less affluent the place they lived was, but it was still an issue across sort of, I think like 90% of the groups that we asked, when you break it down into like socio-economic sort of demographics and things like that, it's still really important across groups. So I think it's an issue that's actually, really important for a wide spectrum of people, even though it is more concentrated in those sort of poorer, more urban central.
I mean, one of the good things about the survey when it finally comes out in a couple of weeks' time is that the sample was big enough that you could drill down into specific sorts of areas. So what it does is compare what different kinds of areas think about different sorts of issues, and it gives a really sort of quite rich picture of the different geographies at work in the UK. Do you want to come in on either of those questions?
Just very briefly, I think crime is something the whole party needs to refocus on. We've let crime, for whatever reason, grow in a lot of the areas where people are most vulnerable, and I think there are interesting trends in Greater Manchester, for example, at the moment, with the police services beginning to focus more on some of the core activities that police are generally associated with in the past, and I think we need an awful lot more of that.
And it comes back to this idea of good public services, and I think that crime and health, there are very clear levers the state can pull to try and do something about that and spend money in those areas. And I think that's where we need to have more of that, particularly in areas that are struggling. And that's what worries me, I think, about the idea that seems if we're going to go through another period of austerity, is that where's the money going to come from to be trying to do that? I think where there are probably less clear levers to pull from a pride of place perspective, if we put crime and health into those buckets, is around high streets. I think if you, it's not clear about if you haven't got underlying demand, how you pull levers to improve high streets. So that's why I think it makes things like crime and health even more important. It's about doing something around those. It also brings us into the element of about where the state can't pull levers so necessarily so easily too. So you can't pull levers to create lots and lots of high skilled jobs in sort of less urban or fairly remote areas, and that's where it's understanding about pulling levers in the areas where you can in terms of crime and health is across the country. In terms of high skilled jobs, that is about investment in some of the biggest cities in particular, and then making sure that areas around them are well connected into those, rather than promising you can pull a lever here which you can't, while not pulling the crime and health levers which the state could very well pull if it so chose to do so.
I mean, Tim, if I can just sort of pick on you again very briefly. I mean, would we be right to be concerned? Because it seems to me that you're absolutely right. We have this shift from the aggregate to the sort of distribution. Very, very sort of simply after the Brexit vote. Virtually everything you hear from this new government now is doing it the other way around. It's explicitly saying it's not about who gets what, it's about the size of the pie. Rhetoric might be a bit obviously
Conservative Party taking place at the moment. It's, everything is under, it's being disguised by all the folks on the opinion polls, etc., and the drama. But Jeremy Clifford, the New Statesman, I was agreeing with my colleague Nick Timothy on Twitter the other night about bonfire of regulations, and I was saying that I believe that 80% of Tory members don't want a bonfire of regulations. And Jeremy's, the New Statesman's point to me was, will it turn out that the May Boris era was an aberration? And my determination is to show that the trust period is the aberration, and that what Boris and Theresa May were trying to do was what the new conservatism needed to be. It wasn't properly defined, it wasn't properly delivered, but this is not what I believe in. This is this conservatism in, well, it's not conservatism in my view, it's libertarianism. I'm a conservative, and I think we need to get back to what May and Boris, however inadequately, were aspiring to deliver.
I mean, one of the most striking things, Sophie, from the survey, I think, is just how successful Theresa May and Boris Johnson were in getting this message across, because that the message about regional inequality has stuck.
Really registered across a really wide spectrum of political beliefs and everything as well, like really strong.
And in contrast to other forms of inequality as well. So, you know, there's far less resonance for in terms of gender or race or giving from the rich to the poor. There's far less support for that than there is for the place-based stuff. So actually, you know, the last 6 years have shifted the dial, it seems to me.
I think the one difficulty with that though is that, so in our survey when we asked obviously, do you support that idea? Most people say yeah, but then when you say, well, do you think your area gets too much money and we can give it to someone else, like absolutely not. No one's going to be happy if we take that away from you and give it to someone else, so that's the political difficulty of this.
It does, I mean, that does point to, you know, the two things that actually the 11th agenda would help Liz Truss's agenda, in that, you know, if you are going for growth, we can identify where there's headroom for growth in certain parts of the country which would bring, you know, prosperity not only to say Birmingham, but the wider West Midlands economy, and that's West Midlands beyond the conurbation as well. But there's also, you know, there's the opportunity to deliver. You know, she made a big thing about I'm here to deliver, I do delivery. Well, there was a white paper, as we were saying, written in February with a number of things in there that could be delivered pretty quickly. Roll them out.
But doesn't that cut against what we've been talking about before, which is actually, if you think the fundamental root of this question is a skills question, that's a medium term at best issue. I mean, that strikes me as being at the heart of this, is you need a government that is willing to say, look, we're not going to get immediate results, but actually if we invest now down the line, we will see the change.
Absolutely.
I just wonder if our politics is capable of that, insofar as it ever was.
Question.
It should be possible, because you look, we had 18 years of Conservative government, then we had 13 years of Labour government, and we've had 12 years of Conservative government. It's actually, when we change governments, if this pattern continues, we keep the colour for a little while, it seems. We shift quite a bit within. It should be possible at the beginning, you know, I think the British people are fair-minded people. At the beginning of a period of government, they're willing to give them the benefit of that, particularly the first election. So, unfortunately, I think this may be an opportunity that falls to the Labour Party rather than to us, but it should be possible for the next period of government to begin with that long term, if it sets in place certain institutional frameworks. You're looking sceptical.
Well, no, it's something I wrestle. I mean, where this debate always takes me is electoral reform, and in the sense that I'm a big fan of our system. I'm a creature of habit. I'm used to the system. I quite like it. Even I detest change at the best of times. It's starting to make. Actually, what you need is a system that allows you to work between parties more effectively, because it's the only way. If we have a system that is so partisan, where the next lot can come in, and part of their mandate is to overturn what the last lot did, how can you ever address a medium-term challenge? And I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I mean, everyone's got a bright idea.
I thought you were going to say education.
I mean, that's obviously part of it. Any more questions or?
I'm Diana Beach, I'm Chief Executive of London Higher, and you'll probably realise why I didn't mention this, we represent London and 40 London universities. So I've been quiet. But there's been a lot of talk about skills skills. I was just wondering in the survey if anyone has recognised the potential of universities in science and research and development for agents of levelling up, because we're not the only cluster in London. There's a massive innovation cluster in the Midlands as well. So I'm just wondering if that came out in the survey.
So we do, it's not that it didn't come out, it's just that our questions didn't really tap into that. As far as I know, the whole sort of annex of questions and everything we asked will get released on the 20th as well, so you can kind of filter for what you want to look into. I mean, the importance of education definitely came through, and something that came through in the focus groups quite a lot was the idea that, you know, if someone's, you know, children wanted to get on and do well and, you know, skill up good to university, they would quite often move away as opposed to staying where they were. So I think there's definitely an argument to be made for the benefits of universities in that way. I do think the other thing that comes through a lot though when we're talking about, you know, skills and education reform and all that kind of thing is a movement away from universities being seen as the only path forward in higher education. I think from my generation in particular, like, it's just sort of become a carbon copy that people go to university straight out of school, and it's not necessarily thought enough, you know, is that actually the best thing for that person to do for the career that they want and the thing they want to go into, and is actually, you know, we've talked about broadening access to universities before. The stuff universities can do can be really beneficial for local communities, but is that actually what that local area needs? Is that the skills that university is going to bring, are they going to benefit its needs and what it wants to do for its local communities, and or is it just sort of a carbon copy of a solution that's worked in one place being plonked down somewhere else and expected to get the same results? So, yeah.
I do think, I mean, at a risk of stoking the ire of colleagues, that universities across the country could and should get a lot better at working with local communities than they have. I mean, universities are actually trying now, you see it, but actually there's been a total failure, I think, to engage with local communities, especially communities who don't usually set their kids to university. And that's something I think universities could do a lot more about going forward.
Yeah, but I think there is a tension there though, where it feels as if we sort of the principal goal of universities is to educate people. We could broaden that, have discussions around that, and then there's a research element of that as well. I think what I'm always nervous of is we lump other things on the top that university should be doing too. So they should be stimulating their local economies, they should be working with their local communities, etc., etc. I think we need to just be careful about not thinking that universities are, oh, we all go, oh, what is the problem? Oh, sorry, what's the answer to this? Oh, I know there's a university over there, so we'll just get them to do it. Well, everyone will point our fingers at them, where there may be some other solutions that requires. So it's always just been a bit careful about that. On the specifics around R&D spend, I mean, that's been something that has raged of coming back to, do we get enough money spent in our area? Transport spend is one that there's a lot of complaints about. R&D spend is the other one. You know, too much money spent within the Golden Triangle. And I think there's a sense of unfairness within that, but there's not a clear understanding about if we were to spend more R&D money in other parts of the country, how would that literally translate into local economic improvements? So if I was to take the example of, which is an extreme example, but I think it helps a thought experiment at least. If we take the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, that was great for mankind, but that happened. You know, and fantastic that part of that has happened in Oxford. The economic impact of that for Oxford itself seems to me that it was almost minimal. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it though, because it was great for UK PLC to some extent, but it was certainly great from a mankind perspective, or humankind, should I say, apologies. So there's this element about how does R&D money actually flow and have that local impact, and whether actually that is again, are we putting too much burden on expecting R&D investment's going to do something that maybe it isn't going, it's going to achieve something else. But what's also interesting about R&D spend is that the government, honestly the current government, I'm never confused whether it's the same government under different leadership or whether it's a new government. Anyway, the Johnson-led government...
We decide that.
The Johnson-led government made a big fanfare about, oh, we're going to increase R&D spending to 2.4% of GDP, and this was seen as a really big thing, said it a number of times, then it went into the white paper. What I recently discovered through some research that we're currently doing on innovation is that the Labour government made a similar commitment to increase it to 2.5% in 2004-2005-ish. So actually, the fanfare we had about this, aren't we brilliant that we're going to do the 2.4, was less ambitious than what had been done previously. And what was even more interesting is that target was set at 2.5%. I think I'm right in saying that over the time the amount of money spent on it's actually gone down as a share of GDP, not gone up. So we've even got an issue there about actually boosting it in the first place before we even get to issues about how that's then spent across the country.
I mean, that's the sort of dark cloud over this whole discussion, isn't it? Is the sort of prevailing economic headwinds, and whether at a time of the various economic crises are saving us, there's going to be space to think about distributional issues.
And that, of course, is why Liz Truss, if she was here, or Kwasi Kwarteng was here, would say they are trying to increase the size of the cake.
Yeah.
So long as you are always mired in these distributional questions, you're playing catch up. So I can understand why they are trying to increase the trend rate of growth. I don't personally agree with their way of doing it.
Or the assumption that the market will allocate the spoils,
Yeah.
which seems right behind it.
Indeed, unless there are market failures in place, that means that investment's not happening in the first place. And so that would then, tie all that then together. A place like Birmingham or a place like Manchester, if we overcome those market failures that mean that they're not as successful as what they should be compared to European comparators, then you are getting that growth. And that's the matchup we need to make. It's not just a case of deregulating off you go. It's actually interventions in the parts of the economy that not make the contribution that they should, but that will require public investment.
So we can all agree that Manchester gets too much. Are there any
Manchester City, not Manchester United.
Yeah, that's a different state. That's not our state. Any more final questions before we? Yeah, Lady in Court.
So I work for MSI Reproductive Choices, so we're a non-profit independent service provider of healthcare. And I was wondering, particularly with like health inequalities, particularly in our area of reproductive health, it's very important issue, problems with access and contraception, and then all the knock-on effects of that. But I was wondering if anything, because a lot of it, lots of reasons for it, but a lot of it is a workforce problem, and I wondered if there was anything in your research or insights about recruiting and retaining the healthcare workforce in particularly the underserved parts of the country and poorer parts of the country. Not just reproductive healthcare, but all healthcare.
I mean, different strands of our work do deal with the sort of immigration question, which is absolutely fundamental to this, yes, but it's not in the survey.
No, not
Though is it not the case that the government has decided not to publish the report that was commissioned on health inequalities? There was a report commissioned under Boris Johnson that this government has decided not to publish, which I have to say struck me as not a good sign in this regard. But
Who was authoring it?
I can't remember. I can better remember my own day. I can find out.
Well, it's not. I think there should be, if it's public money has been spent on a public, on a research project, there should be a commitment to be. That it shouldn't be for ministers to decide to shelve something.
Yeah, no, I agree. Does anyone?
I've got nothing sensible to add, unfortunately.
But I can talk to you afterwards about where to look on the site about the stuff on workforce issues. Okay, I mean, that was an incredibly stimulating debate. I turned up here wondering if we'd actually get an audience and have a conversation. About 10 minutes before we started, there was no one in the room. But thank you to all of you. That was really, really interesting, and particularly to our three panelists. If I can ask one favour of you before you go, it is to make sure there is no food left. Thank you all very, very much indeed.